Hello and welcome to Represent NYC election coverage from Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. Today, we're pleased to bring you a debate in the general election for Manhattan District Attorney. The DA is the chief state-level prosecutor and law enforcement official in the borough of Manhattan, otherwise known as New York County, and responsible for major decisions of law enforcement, criminal justice, freedom and incarceration, public safety, and more. I'll soon introduce you to the two candidates who will be on the ballot for Manhattan voters in the general election. Voting in this race and the others of the general election here in 2021 will be done through absentee balloting. The early voting period, October 23rd through October 31st, and election day is Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. Along with Manhattan District Attorney, there are also elections for mayor, comptroller, public advocate, Manhattan Borough President, City Council, and more. There are also 5 yes/no ballot questions, and we'll discuss those in a separate show, but look out for those choices on your ballot. So with me today for this general election debate for Manhattan District Attorney are the two candidates who will be on the ballot. Alvin Bragg is the Democratic nominee, and Thomas Kenniff is the Republican nominee. Thank you both for joining me. The rules in brief are: we will soon start with our 1-minute opening statements each. That will be followed by a few rounds of questions from me, with each candidate getting 1.5 minutes to respond each time. I may ask follow-ups, so be ready for those. And you'll be given a chance to briefly respond if you're criticized or disagreed with directly in some way at my discretion. There will be one cross-examination round where each candidate gets to ask one question of the other. And if we have time towards the end, and we're running low on time, but I can sneak a few more things in, there might be a quick lightning round of yes, no, or brief answer type questions, and then we'll go to closing statements of 1 minute each. All right, so let's start with our opening statements here. We're going to start with Mr. Kenniff and go to Mr. Bragg, and I'll alternate at different times who starts each round. But Thomas Kenniff, your opening statement, go ahead.
My name is Thomas Kenniff. I'm a former prosecutor, defense attorney, and Army veteran, having served our country in Iraq and having served our city on the front lines of the COVID pandemic at the Javits Center. My candidacy is not about political ascension, partisan affiliations, or personal ambition. It is born out of a deep love for this city and a deeper dismay at what I see happening to it. As a result of misguided criminal justice policies that embrace criminals at the expense of victims, we are seeing an increase in violent crime and a decrease in quality of life like nothing we have experienced in years. Last year alone, shootings in the city doubled and the murder rate increased by nearly 50%. My opponent not only supports these soft on crimes policies, he has proposed to double down on them, calling to eliminate cash bail, advocating to release dangerous felons from Rikers Island, and pledging not to prosecute a variety of serious offenses. Having spent the majority of my career defending the rights of the accused, I understand fairness, but I also know that Manhattan needs a district attorney that will keep us safe.
Thank you, Mr. Bragg.
Thanks. I understand these issues well, personally, from all angles. Growing up in Harlem, I had a gun pointed at me 6 times, 3 by the NYPD during lawless searches, and 3 by people who were not police officers. As a result of those early experiences, I've dedicated my entire career, 20 plus years, to fighting both for public safety and fairness. It's why I went to law school. I went to college and law school at Harvard, came right back to Manhattan, got to work. Started out as a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer, became a federal prosecutor focused on everything from armed robbery to public corruption, and ultimately became the #2 lawyer in the New York State Attorney General's office, overseeing an office of more than 1,500, leading our work on the Trump Foundation and on Harvey Weinstein and his company. All of these experiences, personal and professional, lead me to a vision that marries fairness and public safety. This is my life. This is my life's work. And as a result of it, it's why I've been endorsed by the New York Times, by Preet Bharara, and so many others.
Thank you. So let's go back to you, Mr. Kenniff. In terms of taking over this massive office, this prosecutor's office with hundreds and hundreds of employees and $100 million plus annual budget, if you take over this office or are successful in this election and become the next Manhattan District Attorney, how would you characterize the sort of culture shift that you'd be looking to implement? What would be the big ticket changes to the office that you'd be looking to implement, and you would give those charges to your many assistant district attorneys upon taking office? What would that culture shift look like?
Well, first and foremost, I can tell you as somebody who practices against that office every day and has been doing that for many, many years, is That office is going to need to be rebuilt from the ground up. It has literally been run into the ground over the last several years as a result of the failed leadership of Cy Vance and as a result of the impact that far left progressive criminal justice policies that my opponent supports have had on the office. I literally cannot keep a district attorney on a case. And I'm not talking about the folks that handle low-level misdemeanors. I'm talking about I'm going in on homicide cases I'm handling, sex assault cases, you name it. And virtually every other court appearance, I find out a seasoned district attorney has left the office and they're being replaced by someone who has no experience handling those type of cases. You know, one of the things that I think really shows, you know, how far afield my opponent is when it comes to the notion that he's going to come in and rebuild this office and restructure it. You know, one of the bureaus that he proposed naming in his very far afield day one memo is he's going to create a bureau called the Bureau to Free the Wrongfully Convicted. Now, I'm all for second look bureaus. Mr. Morgenthau, I believe, was one of the first to create one of those. But when you come in and you taking over an office of the size that you mentioned, and you're going to create a bureau called the Bureau to Free the Wrongfully Convicted, what message does that send to the men and women who have really devoted their career to the criminal justice system? Certainly not for money, because they don't make a lot of it.
Thank you. Mr. Bragg, what would your culture shift look like if you take over this office, the charges on day one that you would give to your many assistant district attorneys? What type of changes would you try to bring to the way the Manhattan District Attorney Office functions? Go ahead.
Look, unlike my opponent, I've laid out exactly what I'm going to do. I have a memo which you've alluded to, and I'll respond to some of his baseless accusations in a moment. But I've run a large office. It's a huge difference between the two of us. I've overseen a 1,200 plus office. I know how to get culture change. If we're going to shrink the system, move away from the kind of cases that led to, for example, the deaths of Eric Garner and George Floyd, untaxed cigarettes, counterfeit $20 bill, and focus on the kind of things that people in my neighborhood where I live, having lived here my entire life, gun safety, sex crimes. I've been in the system for 20 plus years as a civil rights lawyer and as a prosecutor, doing the kind of cases, following the money to get real deterrent change that my opponent has not done. Let me speak specifically about the wrongfully convicted. You can tell he has not walked these streets, is not from Harlem, is not from a neighborhood that's been deeply affected by this, doesn't know the legacy apparently of the exonerated five. The notion that he said he's focused on fairness, but doesn't want to do look backs and look at the legacy and free those who are wrongfully convicted. That's a base part of our criminal justice system, and one that I know as a Black person who walked the streets of Harlem and has been stopped at gunpoint by the SWAT team of the NYPD and falsely accused of stabbing someone in Central Park just years after the Central Park 5 bad prosecution. It's just an example. I'm glad he highlighted it because it shows the difference between the two of us. I've walked the walk. I've done the work. I've been with loved ones who've had violent acts happen to them. And I've also walked with those who are fighting civil rights fights. I've done the work. I've managed a case office like this, and I'm ready to serve on day one.
So it seems
Can I
like
respond to that?
we need a little more time to explore some of the things we've already discussed before we move on to anything else. So yes, Mr. Kenniff, go ahead and respond to that. But I also do want to get into these issues that have been raised so far as well about what Mr. Kenniff discussed in his opening statement about bail and about public safety. We obviously want to get into how each of you would try to make the borough of Manhattan and New York City, therefore writ large, a safer place. But go ahead, Mr. Kenniff, what do you want to respond to about the wrongfully accused bureau?
Yes, for this whole, walk the walk myth. Alvin Bragg was appointed as a deputy by disgraced Eric Schneiderman in the New York State Attorney General's office. He stepped into a government position and he did what government folks do. Let me tell you what I've done. I've been a criminal defense attorney for the last 15 years. You want to talk about walking the walk? When Alvin Bragg was serving under his cheerleader, Preet Bharara, and I encourage anyone, if the media actually wants to do their job in this race, take a look on the electronic filing system, take a look on Pacer, see the type of people that Alvin Bragg was seeking decade-long life sentences for as a federal prosecutor, including, by the way, opposing a motion to vacate a life sentence against a nonviolent drug trafficker who was found mentally unfit. That is a fact. That was one of his first published cases. When Alvin Bragg was doing that, I was spending 15 years in this city, not only walking the streets of Harlem, walking all over Manhattan, investigating cases for myself, doing a lot of it, by the way, not for wealthy clients, but as part of the 18B panel, which is private attorneys that are asked to come in and represent indigent attorneys when legal aid can't do it. We get paid $60 or $75 an hour, and that doesn't include secretaries or overhead. So Alvin Bragg has this wonderful backstory about all the guns he had pointed in his face as a teen. I'd like to see how he explains the fact that he's in his 30s, building a resume block in the Southern District of New York, seeking mass incarceratory sentences for nonviolent drug dealers, those who re-entered the United States illegally, and those who possessed simple possession of illegal firearms, which now that he has $1 million in George Soros's money, he says he's not gonna bother too much with illegal gun possession. It is a false narrative.
Go ahead and respond to anything Mr. Kenniff just said, and then we'll move on to a next topic.
The fact that he calls my life a myth disrespects the
No, I never called your life a myth. I said that narrative that you.
Please do not interrupt me. I did not interrupt you.
Let Mr. Bragg respond.
Let's stick to the facts.
The facts are, at 15 years old, and you made fun of it, I had a gun pointed in my face.
No, I never made fun of it, sir. Don't mischaracterize what I said.
You have to let Mr. Bragg respond.
And as a result of that, I have served, and the fact that you dismissed the service that I did to the Southern District of New York and the people of the state of New York, dismissing government service that you want to leave the Manhattan DA's office, says a lot about you. My work, my last 20 plus years, let me tell you about it. I sued the state police for excessive force. I prosecuted an FBI agent for lying and intimidating witnesses. I followed the money and did one of the most significant drug trafficking cases in our region, prosecuting the owner of a $30 million business who laundered millions of dollars of violent drug money. I prosecuted Malcolm Smith, the former majority leader of the state Senate, for bribery. I've done everything from armed robbery to public corruption to civil rights. And I've served, and I'm proud of my service. You can make light of it or joke about the Southern District of New York. I'm proud of having served there. I'm proud of having served in the state of New York. And I put my record up against yours. I'm happy to talk in more detail about it.
So
So am I.
Let me jump in here. There's no question that resumes and backgrounds are very important. We have 28 minutes together. So I do want to move more towards forward-looking policy, what you would do if elected as Manhattan District Attorney. I think that would be the most helpful to voters right now, but absolutely encourage voters to also try to do more research on your individual backgrounds. And you can, of course, raise your resumes and your experiences as you answer other questions here. So let's talk about some of these criminal justice policies that have been mentioned so far. Mr. Bragg, let's stick with you on the question of bail. If you were Manhattan District Attorney, how would you approach requesting bail? How would you approach the bail law? Do you want to see any changes made to the state bail laws that have been changed in different ways over the last couple of years? How would you approach that part of the job?
So let me start with my experience with bail, and I'll go to policies. I've made a bail argument, several as a defense lawyer, several as a prosecutor, but probably most importantly, I posted bail for loved ones. So I know this issue, like all the others in this race, personally. Bail in our state has been about wealth. Mr. Kenniff knows this. He's advocated for bail reductions for clients when he's getting paid for them. I want the same process due to everyone, to the poor and Black and brown, mostly folks who are incarcerated now, facing conditions that are deplorable on Rikers Island. We should not have these wealth litmus tests. And that's what this is about. It's not about some boogeyman of public safety. It is about wealth tests. That's what led to Khalif Browder's death when he was in solitary confinement on a bail for more than 3 years. Mr. Kenniff's record of seeking bail for his clients who he's paid to defend, who are doing violent acts. I just want that for everyone to be focused on the facts, the record, and not have wealth as the test. And that's based on my life experiences.
What would your policy be, Mr. Bragg, as Manhattan District Attorney around bail, and would you be seeking any changes to the current state laws?
Yeah, so I've laid this out in a detailed memo about not having cash bail, having the issue be really focusing on, as we do more so in the federal system, pretrial services for folks, looking at what the law requires, whether someone's able to return to court, and not focusing on their wealth and letting wealth be a litmus test. I think that the bail laws as is, we should leave them. I supported the reforms. And I think that, the last couple of years have been anomalous in so many ways. People who are looking to chisel away and change things let's live under this system and let the data show. And the data does show, for example, on the issue of guns, and I wrote an op-ed on this late last summer, no causal effect between these reforms and the gun incidents. In fact, staggeringly low percentage in terms of people who were it's NYPD data, Mr. Kenniff. If you can shake your head, you can look at my op-ed, the Marshall's NYPD data.
I've looked at some of your op-eds.
Mr. Kenniff, I want to hear broadly your approach to how you would approach requesting bail and bail laws, and if you want to seek changes, you've indicated you do. But I also hope you would address this issue of it seems like some of the critics of the bail changes that have been made really want more people held what is currently against the law, using some sort of judgment of dangerousness that's not really part of what the law is at this point, and setting a high bail to keep more people in, when, as Mr. Bragg indicated, the law is really around flight risk. But go ahead. What would your stance be?
Well, first I would point out, Alvin's claims about no causal relationship. The reality is that on January 1st, 2020, the bail reforms went into effect. Every common sense person knew this was going to be a nightmare. Every judge in that courthouse, all of which are Democrats, every assistant district attorney, the vast majority of which are Democrats appointed by a Democrat, knew what was going to occur. On January 1st, 2020, before COVID, by the way, because I've been on the city on the front lines of COVID. Alvin wants to talk about how I've never done public service. I've served the country. I served the city in uniform. I've done that for the last 18 years, in addition to being a defense attorney. So in fact, bail reform was so bad that even Alvin Bragg's friends in the legislature who passed this disastrous bill had to revise it after the first few months. They voted changes to it in April because the bloodshed was so intense. We had a 100% increase in shootings, a 50% increase in murders. And by the way, we know when there's an increase in violent crime, that disproportionately Black and brown people are going to pay the price for it. So the very people that Alvin talks about how he walks with every day, the policies that he and his progressive friends have championed are terrorizing them the most. Now, you brought up the lack of a public safety exception. Many people lobbied for a public safety exception in this law. It's not against the law. In fact, most states have it. You know who opposed it? The political body of the Legal Aid Society, of which Alvin Bragg sits on. They wanted a law that deprived judges of the ability to incapacitate, to take a dangerous person off the street, even if they were demonstrably dangerous. I'm sorry to say Alvin Bragg and his friends have succeeded admirably. And as a result of that, you can fudge the statistics any way you want. Ask people on the streets in Manhattan, in the neighborhoods that he's talking about, in every neighborhood, whether they're feeling safer post January 1st, 2020, or feeling they're less safe.
But Mr. Kenniff, is there evidence that the people who've been released under the new bail law are in some way significantly contributing to the increases in gun crime?
Of course there's that. We had a 17-year-old young man of color killed the other day in the Bronx. The defendant was brought in on a gun possession case, which Alvin Bragg has said, he's going to take it easy on a lot of gun possession cases because he's had experience with them as a teenager, where he shows that they could be too harsh, despite the fact that as a federal prosecutor in his 30s, he's putting people away for a lot of simple gun possession cases, not gangs, by the way. That individual got out, and 2 days later, he killed a 17-year-old boy. So just within this week, we have one instance of someone who is dead, a mother who's never going to hug her son again, as a result of Alvin Bragg and his friends' soft on crime policies that coddle criminals, dangerous criminals. We're not talking about low-level offenders, at the expense of innocent victims.
Mr. Bragg, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first I want to say I respect your service, Mr. Kenniff. I just want to make that clear. I didn't say I didn't. And in fact, one of the cases I'm most proud of is prosecuting someone who pretended to be a disabled veteran and built the VA out of $16 million of funds that were set aside for disabled veterans. So I don't know where you got that impression from, but I wanted to correct the record on that. Look, what Mr. Kenniff is peddling is something that's, we hear from a lot of people who don't spend times in the neighborhoods most affected. He wants us to choose between fairness and safety. He talks about my friends. I don't know who he's talking about. I can tell you what I do with my time.
Brian Benjamin, for one.
Yesterday, Please, you keep on interrupting. Do you do that in court?
I'm trying to help you out. You didn't know who? I'm jumping and giving you the answer. Our new Lieutenant Governor, Alvin. Go ahead.
You're being arrogant. But I can tell you where I spend my time. Yesterday, I was with 15 clergy members who were calling both at the same time, like I am, for decarcerating and not imprisoning people on matters that don't have to do with public safety, because their members, my neighbors, the people I sit in the pews with, have experienced the horrors of unfairness. But at the same time, and these are the clergy members who've been burying the people who've been killed by gun violence. They're calling for gun cases like the kind I've done. You're right, I have done gun cases. I know that we can have fairness and public safety. It's my life story. It's the people I spend time with, and that's what my policies are born out of. Let's just take guns for an example, because you raised it. At the Attorney General's office, right, we designed a portal. My theory of prosecution is you follow the money and the contraband, right? So we looked at every gun found in a crime scene, giving a law enforcement the capacity to track it back and get real sellers and drivers of this. But that doesn't mean we do every gun case. And you're right, I do know about this. My dad had a gun when I was young. It was unlawful. It was to protect our home. I had him turn it in when he was 65 or so. He wasn't a public safety risk. So yes, my positions are nuanced. They're born of real experience, both in the courtroom and personal, that marry fairness and public safety. We don't have to choose.
Mr. Kenniff,
can I ask Alvin a question about the portal he brought up?
Why don't we come back to that in the cross-examination round if you want to use that as your question. But let me ask you, in terms of reducing gun violence, you indicated you would lobby for state law to be changed to add this judicial discretion around dangerousness. That was debated, as you mentioned. It was debated in the legislature. There was a difference of opinion even within the legislative body, but it was not added to the statute. That would be one thing you would do in an advocacy role. You don't get to obviously make the law as the district attorney. What else would you do as Manhattan District Attorney to try to bring down gun violence?
Yeah, Ben, I'm glad you asked that question, because it's actually 2 points. And interestingly, the New York Times about a week ago and Gotham Gazette a few days ago pointed out that my positions are actually aligned not only with Curtis Sliwa, who's the Republican nominee, of course, but with Eric Adams. Both Eric Adams and myself have called for, one, reforms to the bail reform. Eric Adams, of course, is a Democrat. Eric Adams has also called for reconstituting or bringing back the plainclothes NYPD unit, which was disbanded last summer. And as a result, shootings and gun incidents have climbed ever since. Alvin Bragg is the odd man out in this conversation. Again, it's been pointed out in the New York Times and Gotham Gazette. He opposes both. Alvin Bragg has went on the record and said that he thinks that plainclothes policing is a civil rights issue, the same way he thinks bail is a civil rights issue. It is an agenda that is funded by George Soros, by the way. He's pledged Alvin Bragg $1 million through the Color of Change organization that is based on undermining law and order in the city. Look, some people who interact with the criminal justice system get there by circumstance. They're not all bad people. I know I've represented a lot of them, many of them indigents, by the way, not people who are paying me money. But there are bad individuals in this world. There are street gangs that recruit teenagers out of the very areas that Alvin speaks about. They deal in guns, they traffic in guns, and those guns are deadly. They are not going to hand them over to a uniformed police officer who comes over and says, well, hey, by the way, you're carrying an illegal firearm. We need intelligent, common sense practices like plainclothes policing and anti-crime units. If we're serious about saving lives, Alvin Bragg is on the record diverging with his own party, opposing all of them.
I'm going to let Mr. Bragg respond in a second. Mr. Kenniff, I have to ask you, you've mentioned this twice already. Why are you focused on George Soros? I'm a little confused why you mentioned him twice.
Well, so, it's important to understand, because Alvin talks about his narrative. And look, I'm very sorry for anybody who's had hardships, whether it's guns pointed in their face or whatever else. I've experienced hardships in my youth, okay? But the reality is, Alvin Bragg is not, his movement is not a grassroots movement born in Harlem churches. It is a movement that is sweeping across the country. Look at San Francisco, look at LA, look at Chicago, look at Philadelphia. And the fundamental basis of it is that the American system, as far as the people who support Alvin Bragg believe, is systemically racist and unjust. And the best way to undermine a system that you believe is unjust is to undermine law and order. Go back thousands of years of human history. You can't find a system that isn't based on law and order. George Soros has pledged him $1 million through the Color of Change organization. That's a fact.
Mr. Bragg, let's take a few more seconds here on fighting gun crime and some of what Mr. Kenniff mentioned and your approach to prosecuting gun possession and gun violence.
Sure. So much to respond to. Can I just start with his last point about the Soros and then answer your question? Is that okay?
1 minute. Go ahead.
So look, I'm proud of the broad base of support I have, from Color of Change to Preet Bharara to Elizabeth Holtzman to the unions that represent so many workers. Several prosecutors. I mentioned Preet and Elizabeth Holtzman, folks I serve side by side with. But for this person who doesn't know me to suggest that I don't come out of the churches in Harlem and don't have that support, he clearly hasn't been.
Never said that.
That is where I've lived. That's where I've worked. And that's why I dedicated the last 20 plus years to fighting both civil rights and fairness and public safety, which leads me to the question about guns. Look, this is not something just from my youth. I'm living it right now. I've had 3 gun incidents on my block, so I'm not gonna be lectured to someone who doesn't spend time here. I had a friend who got shot at just a couple of weeks ago. But what I know, and you asked Mr. Max for data from Mr. Kenniff, and he gave you none. Let me give you some. When I was at the Attorney General's office, we looked at stop and frisk. We did a report. It showed that of all the stops from a 4-year period, only 0.1% resulted in a conviction for a gun offense. That's an ineffective policy. I don't want to bring back ineffective policies that affect my neighborhood without results. I know how to do these cases. I've done them. He mentioned it. I've done gun prosecutions. I've done cases that keep us safe. Let's focus on that and not these sort of dragnet, broad things that sweep up young Black and brown New Yorkers. He's right. I'm against that.
We clearly need at least a couple more hours to this debate, but we've got less than 5 minutes left. So I'm going to let you each ask each other one question. The question has to be brief and the answer has to be brief. I don't want to renege on the plan to do this cross-examination round, especially for attorneys here. So I'm going to do that, and then we're going to move to closing statements, and maybe we'll continue this conversation another time. But Mr. Kenniff, why don't you ask your question to Mr. Bragg again, please? Not a big preamble, either of you, to the question, and just ask the question and we'll get an answer, and we'll move to closing statements after this round. Go ahead.
Sure. I'll touch on something I brought up already. Alvin, I brought that case that was in the paper the other day where the individual shot a 17-year-old boy. He had been arrested a few days before on a gun possession charge, released on the sort of bail reform policies that you support. In fact, you said here that you want to eliminate cash bail altogether.
Ask the question.
What would you say to the mother of that child if you were DA and that an individual like that was released under your watch because you opposed bail? What would you say to her?
I don't have to be theoretical about this. I spent 2 days ago with 8 to 10 families who lost loved ones to violence. I talked to them about the realities. I talked to them about having experienced those things. I talked to them about life as I know it and the career I've dedicated to the kind of cases where I followed the guns and followed the money and cleaned up the streets. I've done that. And I talked to them about where they are. So I've done it. It's not theoretical for me. I was doing it just 3 days ago. These are my neighbors, my friends. I understand the pain, and I understand that some of the misguided policies you're talking about, like bringing back stop and frisk, isn't going to address that. So I talk about those realities.
Thank you. Mr. Bragg, your question for Mr. Kenniff.
Yeah, so Mr. Kenniff spent some time, kind of talking about my background. I have spent my whole life here, almost 50 years. He when he filed his campaign work, it showed that he's registered to vote in the Long Island suburbs, and that he hasn't voted here. And I know must be getting asked this question because I'm getting asked it. So I guess I throw it out to you, sort of, what have you been saying to Manhattanites about how you could represent their interests when you're registered elsewhere and don't even vote here?
Well, it's not true. I voted in Manhattan. I raised my daughter in the New York City public schools. I pay taxes in Manhattan. I've lived in Manhattan almost throughout the COVID mission, even though you brought up several times, that you actually denigrated my service, not only as a defense attorney defending the rights of the accused, which you purport to be very, very concerned with, although you've done very little of it. And I've served on the front lines of the Javits Center, and I was living in Manhattan throughout that. If I take this office, as I expect I will, obviously I will reestablish my residency in Manhattan. But this isn't really what people are concerned with. We got Bill Bratton from Massachusetts to turn this city around. This is an operational office, Alvin.
In your closing
And I've run a large office over 1,200. So I understand.
Yeah, you know what? I built a law
office.
live
We're
here.
almost out of time here, so we're going to move to closing statements. You get a minute to say anything else you want to present to voters here in this time. Like I said, we could use a couple more hours. It's been a spirited debate. But Mr. Bragg, your 1 minute closing statement. Go ahead, begin now, please.
All of this work is personal to me. When we talk about the community reinvestment, I think about my mom, who was an educator, my dad, who ran homeless shelters. When we talk about reentry, which we haven't talked about today, which is dear to me, I think about my brother-in-law, who was incarcerated and came and lived with me after incarceration. When we talk about violent crime, I think about having had a semi-automatic weapon to my head, a homicide victim on my doorstep, and a knife to my neck. When we talk about addiction, I think about my father's addiction. I've taken all of these personal experiences and they've driven me to a career where I've married fairness and public safety, doing cases like prosecuting the former majority leader of the state senate for bribery, prosecuting large dealers of drugs who are laundering money for drugs, prosecuting cases involving sexual assault. That's where our focus needs to be. That's what I've done. And I'm proud of my endorsements, from Color of Change to Preet Bharara to Zephyr Teachout to Elizabeth Holtzman, to all the working people who know that I'm going to center their trauma and their needs in this office. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Mr. Kenniff, your 1 minute closing statement. Go ahead.
Yes, I believe that this is a race that should transcend party politics. The fact of the matter is I'm not a political person. I've never sought political office. I've received no financial support from any national, state, or local political party. I believe public safety has no party. And I know from talking with folks all over Manhattan, including the neighborhoods Alvin's talking about, by the way, that too many people no longer feel safe. I have devoted my entire career to the criminal justice system as both a prosecutor and a defense attorney. In fact, mostly as a defense attorney, representing overwhelmingly indigent defendants on the civilian side and the military side. Where others have run away from battles, I have run into them. And that's what I'm doing now. New York City teeters on a precipice. We can continue to stand by as innocent lives, many young, Black and brown, become victims of bloodshed, or we can call on our better instincts and make a common sense choice to place the issues above politics and vote the candidate, not the party. I'm confident if we do that, I will be your next district attorney, and together we will save lives.
Thank you. Thank you to both candidates. As I said, it's been a spirited debate. We could go on for much longer, but folks who got a taste of the race here can find much more information from Manhattan Neighborhood Network, Gotham Gazette, and elsewhere. Thank you, both candidates, and thank you for watching Represent NYC election coverage here on MNN. I hope this debate is helpful to you as you make your choices ahead of the fall general election. I'm Ben Max. See you next time.